Today we're looking at chapters 21 and 22 of Yehoshua. But I want to start considering chapter 22 first, because it completes the narrative about the return of the eastern tribes to their possession in the territory east of the Yarden River. Now, chapter 22 begins with the release of the fighting men of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh, who had completed their obligation to help their brothers to conquer the Amori and the Canaanite kings. So, having completed their task, they were now free to return to their territory east of the Yarden, which Moshe had agreed that they could possess. So upon their release, Yehoshua imposes one last obligation upon them, as we read in verse 5. To love Yahweh your God, follow all his ways, observe his mitzvot, cling to him, and serve him with all your heart and being. Then in verse 8, Yehoshua finally says, return with great riches to your tents, with many livestock, with silver and gold and bronze and iron, and with great quantities of clothing. Share the spoils with your kinsmen. So the spoils of war were their reward for the efforts alongside their brothers, the 9 from the other 9.5 tribes. So next we see the building of an altar. The narrative does not say where they crossed the Yarden. All that we are told is that they left with the people of Israel and Shiloh and headed for the land of Gilead, which is east of the river. However, before crossing the river, they built a large, impressive altar on the plains somewhere near the banks of the Yarden. It appears from the narrative that it may well have been a last-minute decision, as the rest of the people of Israel were left back in Shiloh, were amazed that the 2.5 tribes had done this before they actually crossed over the river. Clearly, there had been no discussion about the proposed altar while they were together in Shiloh. Therefore, the reaction of the people from the 10 tribes was this total dismay. Fearing a division was occurring, the community of Israel sent Pinhas, the priestly son of the Kohen HaGadol, to investigate why this altar had been built, and particularly without any prior consultation. Also, why did they build it on the western side of the river? Could it have been a result of that final obligation that Yehoshua imposed upon those departing tribes? With the words still singing in their ears, had they decided at the spur of the moment to act on his last words in a way that they thought would please Yahweh? Yehoshua said, after all, take great care to obey the mitzvot of Torah. Whatever their reason, Pinhas alone, along with the 10 tribal leaders, one from each of the western tribes, were dispatched to confront the eastern tribes with the following challenge. Here is what the whole community of Israel is saying. What is this treachery that you have committed against the God of Israel, turning away today from following Yahweh, in that you build for yourselves an altar, thus rebelling against Yahweh? Pinhas was certainly the right man to lead a delegation to challenge the reason for the altar and why it was built in such a strange place, particularly as it was not the place that Yahweh had selected. Pinhas, having been one who had brought an end to the plague which struck Israel while they camped on the plains of Moab, he certainly was the right person for such a task. It appeared the eastern tribes were actually breaking away from Yahweh and also from their western counterparts. Now, Pinhas launches forth with a strongly worded outburst against the eastern tribes. In verses 17 through 20, he reminds them again of all that occurred in the Peor incident. The whole tone of the outburst reflected just how tentative he considered the whole relationship of Israel towards Yahweh. As we read in verse 17, we haven't cleansed ourselves from all this even to this day. even though a plague came upon the community of Yahweh. Now his words express deep underlying fear, that as he continues in verse 18, if you rebel against Yahweh today, he will be angry tomorrow with the whole community of Israel. So in 19, he pleads his case with a very interesting remark. If the land that you have taken possession of is unclean, then cross back into the land which belongs to Yahweh, where the tabernacle of Yahweh is located, and take possession amongst us. But don't rebel against Yahweh, and don't rebel against us by building yourselves an altar in a place other than where Yahweh wanted it. So Pinhas said all this without giving the leaders of the eastern tribes a chance to express their reason for building this altar. It was simply assumed by Pinhas and the people of the western tribes that the altar was built as pure rebellion. That was a bold assumption on their part. As I suggested earlier, the building of the altar was most likely a spontaneous event, an act that had not been considered even while they were still in Shiloh. So having suspected there was a bad motive, Pinhas provided them no room for explanation. Finally, he concludes with his accusative comments, reminding them what had happened after the fall of Jericho, when Achan stole and hid the forbidden booty. That action of one man had brought about the wrath of Yahweh down upon the whole community. The crime of one man cost the lives of many in their next battle against the men of Ai. Israel were defeated because of one man's wrongful action. So Pinhas appears to be gravely concerned that the eastern tribes are now being rebellious by their actions. So why was the altar built? Pinhas is told by the leaders of the eastern tribes they elected to build the altar on the western side of the river, and they start to respond by conceding that if they were wrong and built the altar without Yahweh's permission, then their actions would not be justified. In verse 22, their words take the form of an oath before Yahweh when they said in their own defense, "The mighty one is Yahweh. If we act in rebellion or treachery against Yahweh, then don't vindicate us today." So having made that oath, they proceeded to explain to Pinhas why they had built the altar. From their perspective, the reason was totally justifiable. They reasoned that it would bring them closer to Yahweh their God. It appears that they had not forgotten what Yahweh had commanded in Torah, that every man of Israel was to go to the place that Yahweh would choose 3 times a year, with thanksgiving offerings to be placed on the one and only altar that Yahweh himself had selected. Their explanation in verse 23 explains their reasoning by saying, "We haven't built the altar in order to turn away from following Yahweh, or to offer on it burnt offerings, grain offerings, or sacrifice of peace offerings. If we have, then let Yahweh himself require us to atone for it." Instead of turning their backs on Yahweh, their explanation is totally justifiable, in that they were trying to come closer to Yahweh, even though they had elected to live outside of their land. Their reason for building the altar on the western side of the river was both far-sighted and sensible. As they explained in verses 24-25, "We did this out of anxiety, because we thought sometime in the future your descendants might say to our descendants, 'You don't have anything to do with Yahweh, the God of Israel, because Yahweh made the Yarden the border between us and you.'" Their motive for building the altar was truly justified. They were correct in saying that they were living outside of the territory Yahweh had promised to their forefather Abraham. So they were fearful that they would in the future lose their rights as part of Israel. They had no intention of using it as for sacrificial purposes, but instead as a permanent memorial marker that those on the eastern side of the river were still part of Israel. They concluded that their well-reasoned response with the following statement in verse 29, "Far be it from us that we should rebel against Yahweh and turn away today from following Yahweh by building an altar for burnt offerings, grain offerings, sacrifices, and anything other than the altar of Yahweh, our God, which stands in front of the Mishkan." So the matter is settled. Pinhas and the leaders of the 10 tribes from west of the river returned to Shiloh with a good report. There is no need for war against the brothers on the eastern side of the river. The whole situation had been one of bad communication on the part of both parties. If Pinhas and his group had been more considered in their approach, they would have heard the reason for the altar being built, which was an honourable one. Conversely, the eastern tribes had not been able to communicate their intentions before they departed from Shiloh, so the situation developed in their absence. Both parties were lacking good communication skills. Even in today's world, if reasons for certain actions are not shared with others, they can have direct effects. They can often develop to a degree of distrust, and if allowed to remain unclarified, can often end up in disaster or unending distrust of one another. Now finally, the chapter reaches a happy climax in verse 33, where the people of Israel blessed God and said no more about going to wage war against the descendants of Reuben and Gad. However, regrettably, there is a footnote to this chapter, which we find in 1 Chronicles chapter 5, verses 23 through 26. It says, "The descendants of the half-tribe of Manasseh lived and increased in the territory of Bashan, but they broke faith with God of their ancestors and prostituted themselves to gods of the people of the land, whom God had destroyed ahead of them. So the God of Israel stirred up the spirit of Pul, king of Ashur, and the king carried them away as captives. In spite of that first generation who decided to reside in the east of the river, were wanting to always be considered as part of the rest of Israel, they themselves brought demise upon themselves by turning their backs on Yahweh. As the generations passed, they did the very thing that they did not want to happen. It occurred because of their own actions. That is one of the ironic characteristics of humanity. We can all be drawn away by things that seem as desirous, but may not be beneficial for our overall development. Such was the situation with the tribes east of the river. While that first generation had every intention of remaining as part of Israel, the influence of their neighbours and the degree of isolation across the river resulted in their spiritual drift. Even in the time of Yeshua, as we read in Luke chapter 8, Yeshua had to make a deliberate journey across the lake to speak to the people on the eastern side of the river, which by that time was known as the region of Gerizim. It was there that he met the man possessed with many demons. We read Yeshua drove the demons out of the man into the pigs. But later, when the people of the region saw what Yeshua had done, what was their response? All the people of the Gerizim district asked him to leave them, for they had been seized with great fear. So he boarded the boat and returned. Now the man from whom the demons had gone begged that he might go with Yeshua. But Yeshua sent him away, saying, "Go back home and tell the people how much God has done for you." He went away, proclaimed throughout the town and the surrounding district how much Yeshua had done for him. So we see from Yeshua's own encounter with the people of Gerizim, even during his time, there was still a remnant of Israel who knew about the past. But the whole region had been given over to a mix of people from many different places, all under the rulership at that stage of the Seleucids and the Parthians, and then finally the Romans. As we saw, the events played out around that region as part of the Hanukkah narrative. So the whole eastern side of the Yarden remained under the regional name of Perea, meaning beyond, because it was east of the Yarden. Perea was claimed by the Maccabees around 200 BCE. Pardon me. And by the time of Yeshua, the population was mainly Yehudi, or Jewish. It was also part of the tetrarchy of Herod Antipas during the 1st century, along with the area of the Galilee. It remained that way until around 640 CE, when the Arabs conquered the whole territory, and it has remained under Muslim control, and latterly under the Ottoman Empire until World War I, when the Arab League offered support to the Allied forces to bring down the Ottoman Empire. Now, following World War I, the territory was then divided up and given to the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, and it has remained as part of Jordan until this day. And that I have spoken about in my book, The Scriptural Two-State Solution. Now that brings the history of the eastern tribes and the region east of the Yarden River to a close. Now let's consider chapter 21 and how it relates to the tribe of Levi. Having considered the resettlement of the tribes in the east of the river, it is now time to turn our attention to that 13th tribe of Israel, that is, the tribe of Levi. By adopting Ephraim and Manasseh as his own sons, Patriarch Yaakov created 14 tribes in all, comprising his own 12 natural sons, along with Joseph's 2 sons. But at no stage did Yahweh ever intend there to be more than 12 tribes to inherit that land. As we've seen previously, Joseph was dropped from the list of the tribal collection, and the descendants of Yaakov. That still leaves us with 13 tribes. But Yahweh instructed Moshe that the whole tribe of Levi should be set apart from the other tribes, and their service at the Mishkan would be their inheritance. However, now that all Israel had been established in the land, the tribe of Levi also needed cities in which to dwell. They needed cities that they could call their own. So in the opening 3 verses of chapter 21, the clans of the tribe of Levi approach Eleazar, the Kohen Gadol, or high priest, and demand that they be given cities to live in, along with the open land for their livestock. Now the verses speak of the tribe of Levi as being the Levi'im, which is a title given to those who serve on a daily basis in the running of the temple and also the maintenance. As we see, they approached Eleazar, who was, of course, himself a descendant of Levi through the clan of Kehat. But he was different because he was the 3rd son of Aaron. Now, Yahweh had instructed that the line of Aaron would be further set apart from within Levi'im for the role of Kohanim. Just as the other 12 tribes had been allocated land by drawing of lots, so were the cities for the Levi'im. They were also drawn by lot. The first lot fell to the clan of Kehat, who along with the Kohanim, who are the descendants of Aaron, were being allocated cities in the territories of Yehuda, Shimeon, and Benjamin. Now it's an interesting twist that at the time of the allocation, their cities were well removed from the location of the Mishkan, because it remained in Shiloh, which is further north, up in the territory of Ephraim. It remained there until the time of King David. However, following the building of the temple in Jerusalem, the Kohanim, who were residing in the territories of Yehuda, Shimeon, and Benjamin, then, of course, were reasonably close to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. It almost appears that Yahweh assigned them the cities close to Jerusalem, knowing that in the future that would be the city of his choice eternally. So the remaining families of Kehat were given 10 cities in the territories of Ephraim and Dan, and the western half of Manasseh. That allocation was again followed by 2 further lots, the clans of Gershon and Merari. Each of these were dispersed throughout the remaining tribal territories, both east and west of the Jordan. A large portion of chapter 21 is devoted to the naming of the cities which were given to the 3 clans with their open spaces. The choice of the cities for the Leviim concludes in verse 39 by saying, all the cities of the Leviim were 48 cities. So the narrative about the possession of the land draws to an end. All the territory that had been promised to Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov had finally been allocated to the 13 tribes of Israel. Yehoshua, with the support of Yahweh, had vanquished all 7 of the nations that had occupied the land since before the promise was made to Abraham. Also, Yahweh had handed over to Israel all their enemies, including the Anakim, who had engendered such fear in the minds of the first generation spies. Everything Yahweh had promised he would do has now been done, and Israel can settle down to enjoy the fruits of their labor. Their primary obligation was to observe the commands of Torah and appear in Shiloh 3 times a year with a basket of first fruits from the produce of the land. All that Moshe had strived to achieve through the 40 years following Israel's exodus from Egypt, and the effects of Yehoshua's having taken the people across the Jordan, was now finally coming to fruition. It appears, though not stated, the whole process of displacing those 7 nations and the Anakim took a period of between 5 and 12 years. Now that brings us to the end of all the wars of displacement and the capture of over 250 cities and villages spread throughout the territory that Yahweh had promised to their forefathers. That leaves just 2 more chapters in the book of Yehoshua, in which we will see Yehoshua admonishes Israel to constantly observe the mitzvot of Torah as Yahweh had passed it on to Moshe. That will bring us to the final words of Yehoshua as he himself prepares to join his forefathers in the sleep of death. All that will be considered next Shabbat. Shabbat Shalom.